Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Intersections, Mission to Innovate. I'm Jack Johnson, and I'm joined with Kuan Collins and Prachi Sukhtenkar here at the Spark Studio. In a world that's increasingly complex, a together is better mindset is required across all disciplines to create a seamless and connected innovation ecosystem that drives agility, adaptability, trust, and transparency. It's critical for all organizations to understand and achieve high-quality collaboration and ultimately a culture of innovation. In this episode of the podcast, Kuan and Prachi are discussing interorganizational collaboration, how it's foundational for sustainable growth, and their real-world experiences and stories. Hey, you two. So glad to be launching the new Intersections Mission to Innovate series with you guys. I'll go ahead and let you take it away, and you can tell us a bit about yourselves and this exciting new project.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kuan Collins, and I'm Innovation Factory Director at SAIC. I've been with SAIC for a long time, almost 2 decades, and have had a variety of different roles, from program management to systems engineering. I worked with Prachi in our analytics simulation service line. Most of my latter career was around solution architecture, where I focused a lot on how do we bring technologies together and integrate them to solve customer problems. And in that context, and in working with Prachi, found that there were a lot of reasons to sort of step back and think through how we bring these technologies to bear for our customers. And it was so much more than just the technology side of this. It was more about the cultural aspect, the methodologies and the approaches. And so as Prachi and I talked about, our interests beyond work, this idea of intersections and this discourse around innovation and what creates innovation and what allows innovation to thrive was born. And this idea for the podcast was born. Some of my other activities are around teaching. I teach at the University of Maryland, and I teach at the University of Alabama in Huntsville around data analytics and how we bring analytics capabilities to bear. And what I found in my career in general, that I've always wanted to be at that point where I'm helping to create the next thing, right? To help people to keep moving forward. And so that's definitely inspired the reason why we're here today. Over to you, Prachi.
Hey everyone, Prachi here. I'm excited to be here to launch this podcast. And just like Kuan, I'm a technologist, a strategist, and a little bit of innovator thrown there, right? That's my core. And I really like to think of a better world and outcomes for whatever I'm working on, and then push towards that by sometimes defining the strategy. Sometimes it's about building the right teams, thinking of the right innovation structures, and scaling through that. So as a little bit of my background, I'm an engineer and a computer science graduate. I spent my early career learning and applying a lot of different technologies across different domains, which was super interesting. And then I moved into more R&D, big data, analytics, AI, those type of themes. But really being a technology fellow for a large services company allowed me to look across and have that big picture view and mentor researchers and look at what is really needed from an impact standpoint. So for the last couple of years, I am the vice president of technology in a large services organization, and really looking at the full spectrum of not just strategy, discovery, and technology solutions, but also how do you tie that to the technology brand from an external customer standpoint. So beyond my usual technologist profile, I enjoy exploring topics at the intersection of business, technology, design, and humanities. And Kuan, I think that's probably how you and I started talking about this podcast, right? So Kuan, did you want to talk a little bit about the concept of intersections?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Prachi and I worked together at the SAIC a few years ago. And I think we were kindred spirits in the context of what Prachi was just describing, which is not only focusing on the technologies that we want to bring to the community and to our customers and our organizations, but really what does it take for that adoption and that process and approach to really take advantage of that technology to bring those outcomes to bear, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about AI or cloud or
Mm-hmm.
reality. It's about the experience that we want in the organization that we're working in, and that technology needs to enable that experience. And so what we observed with the engagements that we had with our customers is that most often people wanted to sort of jump to, let's implement, this new technology. Let's try out AI. And we really needed to sort of do a little bit of education and step back to say that before we talk about the technology, there really is a lot to be described and discussed in terms of what's the problem that we're trying to solve, right? What's this environment that we're trying to create? And so this podcast around intersections was really to sort of get to that conversation, because there's so much to unpack. And then as Prachi and I started planning this podcast and thinking about the topics that we wanted to discuss, I mean, we couldn't, there was no end in sight. We have this mind map that kind of goes on for days,
Mm-hmm.
all the areas that we want to uncover. And so we're really excited to bring this to the community, and we're hoping to engage with everybody, the people that we work with in our network, and bring guest speakers to talk about this really important topic to us anyways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll also say that, when we were talking, Kuan, intersections is where interesting cafes thrive, right? By definition.
Yes.
And, we've talked that, I've always found cafes very appealing. You are sort of away from your usual workplace or your home, but you are still, in a cozy place. And hopefully you are hanging out with interesting friends. So in my head, that kind of setup has all the ingredients. It has that environment where you just automatically increase your chances of something exciting and unusual happening. So, in that context, it's not very formal. And if there is a group where there are silos because maybe you have different trade, you have some different perceived notions, then there is a very good chance that they will be dissolved, right? And I mean, we are all for specializations. We have our specializations, but there is absolutely a greater value in bringing your specialization to the table along with an open mind. So that analogy really, fits when we think of intersections. And as Kuan and I joke around, we are here for the cafe and not necessarily for the coffee.
Love the analogy of the cafe. And I know we've talked about this, but this idea of collaborative circles, I think I brought that topic up with you before. But as you look historically around groups that have been innovative, like the Inklings, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and how they got together in the pubs and in the cafes. And it was all about that discourse that they were able to have together that allowed their innovative ideas to thrive. That's really what we want to create here with that podcast. So with that, let's get to it. So Prachi, let's start with talking about inter-organizational collaboration today and some of the structures through which inter-organizational collaboration happens.
Sure, yes. So certainly, by definition, when we talk about inter-organizational structures, there are multiple organizations involved. And so partnerships between those organizations, it's like the most basic or popular one, right? And even there, you can conceptually think of whether the partnership is more strategic, has a long-term horizon, or it's a little bit more opportunistic. But beyond that, I would say, this more than anyone, Kuan, but when you are doing research, there is co-authoring of papers, jointly writing books. To me, that's a great, really deep collaboration structure. And one of my favorite ones, which may not be very intuitive, but, I've taken a whole bunch of online courses and forums. For example, I took all kinds of certifications and programs in innovation, in leadership. What I've noticed is that if that program, especially for online courses, has a well-moderated forum, then that's a very enjoyable and very collaborative experience. So those are, I think, some of my favorite ones. How about you, Kuan?
So I've been really interested in this idea of the innovation stakeholder ecosystem. So I think from a scholarship perspective, right, early on when we talk, I mean, innovation has been around for a long time, right? And the concept early on was this idea that you had this triple helix, right? So you had government, you had academia, you had industry working together to sort of bring this innovation to bear. And I think what happened over time, right, is all of those institutions have become very large institutions. And so while that innovation sort of spark happened when they were smaller, as they became larger organizations, the bureaucracy sort of took over a little bit, right? You have sort of that need to sort of strategically look at what's sustainable versus like trying new things all the time. And so in the new context of this innovation stakeholder ecosystem is the introduction of non-traditional smaller businesses like startups. And so as you asked me about interorganizational collaboration, the picture that came to mind was the startup accelerators and bringing together, you know, startups, larger businesses, government agencies, and academia all in one place. And having that is really, it's interesting. Like I had the experience of working at the Capital Factory in Austin, Texas. And for the first time, I saw government really changing their behavior when they were in this environment, intentionally breaking down the barriers, breaking down the silos, getting past sort of the, you know, rank structure. You know, I think I mentioned, right, General Murray, a four-star general, coming to the Capital Factory with, you know, civilian clothing, which is unheard of, right?
Right,
And
right.
really was an interesting shift in behavior, acknowledging the things that we're talking about here with respect to having that dialogue and that serendipitous meeting in the cafe to really just talk about ideas and for that to stimulate the kind of creative thinking and learning behavior that's required for innovation to thrive. So that to me is like, it's very exciting in terms
Absolutely.
of seeing these organizations realize what it takes to really get to that culture of innovation.
Right, right. And on that spectrum, and speaking of new things and behavior, I think on the other side, we have social media, right? I mean, while it has its pros and cons, I do think that that can be considered as a top-notch collaboration and innovation structure. And it has been used that way in many, many, many instances. The other thing which I think is very common, and especially now that we are kind of getting outside of the whole post-pandemic zone, is conferences, right? So I think to me, it's important for any organization or individual to look at all the different collaboration structures and pick the right ones, right? Because at the end of the day, it's an optimization or prioritization mechanism there. So thinking of that, you know, Kuan, we've talked about organizational level impact. And if an organization is just starting, let's say, their digital transformation journey, then what are some of the first steps that they could be taking? What should they care for initially, you know, along that journey? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so many things come to mind. The quote that I love comes from Peter Drucker. At least that's how everybody attributes it always to him. But the quote is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. What that means, right, and I just break it down a little bit, is that regardless of the strategy that you have, right, and all the good intentions that you have as an organization to build that technology, whatever it is that you're trying to do, if you don't pay attention to the culture, it really has a way of just taking over, right? So because to your point, you mentioned conferences, right? We go to conferences, we engage with our colleagues, we have all these amazing ideas, right? We come away buzzing, thinking of all the cool things that we just heard about and that we want to implement. And then if you come back to an organization where culturally it doesn't sort of match, right? There's no match with what you experienced in the conference, and you come back to your day-to-day, all of a sudden, all of that excitement is gone, right? Because you have to go back and focus on what you have to do in that culture. And so for an organization to want to have that sustained level of fire in everybody's belly about what's going to come next. How do I keep, pressing forward, bring these new technologies, create this better customer experience? They need to have that space in the organization to feel like they can be creative, to have that what they call psychological safety to bring new
Absolutely.
ideas to bear. To have that like even sandbox environments, right? To do the experimentation and realize, back to the psychological safety, that if that experiment doesn't work out, that's okay. We still learned from that experience. And so I think an organization needs to see that that kind of an environment needs to exist in order for their employees to really feel like it's okay. That feeling of excitement and bringing a new idea is absolutely the kind of behavior we want in this organization.
Right, right. And that goes back to, that cafe-like environment that we were talking about, but also really, I think, is important to drive that from a top-down advocacy within an organization. And it's really about, how can we make sure that every day is like day one? Meaning it
Mm-hmm.
has that kind of energy, it has that kind of focus and sharpness, right? And I talked about some of the partnerships and the types of partnerships. To me, I think in an organization's early journey, thinking through some of that is important, because that is a little bit of what I think of as a low investment, right? Like your potential partners are already out there. So thinking of, which could be the strategic ones, which could be a little bit tier two, that's important. There is so much going on in terms of public sector and private sector partnerships, as you were alluding to earlier, Kuan. But then there is also, the established companies versus startups and what are the collaborations among them. And what I also find interesting is academia, right? There is a ton of research that's going on. And how does industry take that and scale
Mm-hmm.
that, commercialize that, so that all of that knowledge really is now aligned from a business standpoint, from
Mm-hmm.
an impact standpoint. So those are some of the things that are, I think, absolutely critical, especially for an organization on its early journey.
I love that point about leveraging scholarship and academic research.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big issue that we have in so many domains in our industry, but you look across all domains and there is this gap between, the academic research and then practice. And there's this constant struggle to figure out how do we close that gap, right? And do a better
Mm-hmm.
job of leveraging what academia is doing. And I think the responsibility is on both sides, right? I think it's both on industry to reach and pull that in, as well as for academia to sort of have that practitioner viewpoint so that the research is actionable, like that
Right.
we do something with what they're doing. So I love that point. So do you have an example, Prachi, of a time when interorganizational collaboration did something unique that you did not anticipate?
Right, right. Yeah. So Kwan talked about some of the courses and my experiences through that. I have to mention there was this amazing certification that I did with University of Virginia's Darden School, and that was called Specialization in Design Thinking and
Mm-hmm.
Innovation. So if our audience doesn't know design thinking, it is, very simply a human-centered approach to innovation and making sure that you define the complex problems before you embark on the journey to solve them. And then, how do you solve them using rapid prototyping and things like that. So it was an amazing experience for me. That philosophy and those principles really stuck with me. And then a year later, when I was part of Northern Virginia Technology Council's Digital Transformation Committee, I started thinking about why not think of the interplay of design thinking and digital transformation? What does that mean? So I ended up reaching out to the CEO of an innovation company, and that firm just embodies all these principles of design thinking. And our first meeting, I have to say, was in a cafe. We scribbled on, some pieces of paper, drew some diagrams, and then we ended up holding almost a 3-hour long workshop for the industry about this topic. It was something we could have never planned for ahead of time individually if we, had thought of it. It was super fun. I think to me, it was the hallmark of collaboration. And then I ended up introducing some of those principles and that thinking into my work when I launched some of my R&D projects, right, across analytics, across predictive maintenance, process automation, and things like that. So very, very, fascinating experience there. And I know, Kuan, that you've, operated in similar spaces with Capital Factory. Thanks to you, I visited that in Austin. Wonderful experience. So anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. So when I think about unexpected things, so one of the reasons that I moved to Austin was my first visit to Capital Factory. I was invited to participate in a workshop that our customer, it was the Air Force, where we were building the Pilot Training Next program. And what they wanted to do was have a workshop around their next phase. So we had done phase 1 and we built the initial prototype for Pilot Training Next. And they wanted to investigate what they were going to do for phase 2. And in the course of helping them with designing the workshop, our customer had asked us to invite people from all kinds of organizations, like our competitors, like other agencies, other programs that had nothing to do with Pilot Training Next. And it was very much a human-centered design approach, thinking, solving the problem, where you bring people from multiple different domains so that you can get that broad perspective. But I think I had never seen it like in action in the government, seen it in workshops, or I had seen it in courses that I had taken, or, thought about it theoretically. But to see it in action and to see the customer driving it was very exciting to me. And I mean, that's sort of what really inspired me to think about, building our office there and, taking part in this and really helping to lead it for the government. And this workshop was fascinating because it did bring together people around a problem that ordinarily we wouldn't have done it that way, right? Usually the government tends to be very closed, right? It's because we're protecting the data or protecting the idea or something like that. And this one, I mean, everything was on the table. And the engagement that occurred because of that was, it was just so much fun to see and so much fun to be a part of. And it sparked all kinds of ideas in everybody's mind, and it was like palpable, you know what I mean?
Right.
In the room. And so that was just one example that came to mind. But a lot of the engagements in Capital Factory just is like centered around this idea of intersections, right? It's all about the running into each other in the elevator and just asking each other, what you're working on. And then that leading to, hey, let's talk more about that idea that you just came up with, because I don't know if it fits with the problem that I have, but I think it might. So, let's follow up with that thought. And having that serendipitous, activity where it doesn't have to be driven by, I have this task that I have to complete, and I need you to help me with this problem. It just happens because we've inspired each other, right, to think about things in a different way.
Right. And that cross-disciplinary approach is where typically the magic happens. Exactly. And you kind of know, when that magic happens, that something different and something, innovative, that stretch the envelope has happened, right?
Right.
So I know that you and I, we love these conversations. We both derive energy and excitement out of this. But we also know that, it's not all unicorns and rainbows, right? Like sometimes it's not that great. Sometimes there is a need to almost step back and think of, where things are probably not going well. So when it comes to these collaboration structures and innovation, do you have like a pet peeve? And I know I have a few, but let's start with yours.
So my biggest pet peeve is the assumption that this is a given. The idea of collaboration and innovation, everybody, sometimes we talk to our customers or just, internally, and everybody nods their head. They're like, yeah, of course we want collaboration, and of course we want innovation. And this assumption that it's not complicated, right? That this isn't hard, that we can just go into a engagement with a customer or with, an internal project, and that collaboration will just happen without having any intention to set it up and sort of set the ground rules, if you will, for how this is going to go, and make sure that there's almost, I don't want to say guardrails because you don't want to contain it or control it. At the same time, you want focus on generating this kind of energy and excitement, inspiration, and you want to sort of remove any kind of barriers to that. I also think that, sometimes we think that just because we've met, right, that we're in meetings all day long, or that, we were on Zoom, that we have collaborated. But, when you look back, right, and when you think about it and analyze those meetings, have we really moved the needle forward, right? So just endless meetings and the fact that we gather doesn't equate to the kind of thing that we're talking about, where we have created something new, right? A new service, a new product, a new way of thinking about something. And so having that intention is very important. And I guess my biggest pet peeve is that the lack of understanding that that's not easy to do.
Right. Yeah, you hit there something, you hit the nail for me. I often say that just because, we are venturing on something creative, something innovative, doesn't mean it has to be chaotic. Quite the contrary, right? Yes. Like this is not about just general chaos and let the stuff happen. So certainly that, and something else that you had talked about earlier about like conferences and shows, that's one of my pet peeves, where, we build a lot of momentum, a lot of energy, not to mention a lot of effort and dollars sometimes go into these events. But then how do you really weave that into the fabric of the organization? How do you maintain that when you come back? And more importantly, how do you, measure the metrics out of this or any kind of collaboration activity, right? I mean, ultimately, it's all about the cost to benefit ratio. It's all about the ROI. So those are, I think, some of the things where I am generally very careful, always trying to think of what's the most optimal way. How can I streamline any activity and how can I tie that to the business outcomes? So, just switching gears a little bit, I was thinking, what might be an inter-organizational collaboration avenue that maybe is not very mainstream, but if we had to just ideate a little bit, right, among ourselves, that it might be something interesting and useful to have. Any thought there?
So I think when I think about the innovation structures that we try, that we talked about, and like this idea innovation hubs, right? That's become very popular. What I think about is that we don't manage them in the way that we manage other things within the organization. So this idea of an innovation pipeline, where it's not just a one-off thing, right? We don't just build the facility and we don't just have the demo, that it's this ongoing, dynamic, living thing that we are intentionally managing, but it's not chaotic, to your earlier point, and that we put resources to it, and we also create metrics, right, so that we can manage and see what those ROIs are. And it may not be so clear cut, right, because it's sort of a different activity than our typical engagements, contracts, and projects, but we have to kind of look at it in that sort of structure so that we create that sustained level of activity that we want. We can create that, what we get from conferences and manage that, throughout the year as opposed to just a couple times a year.
Absolutely. And just for fun, just to stretch sort of our imagination here, when I was thinking of a potential future or futuristic collaboration structure, want to start by just sharing, some sort of little experimental project that I did a few years ago. And that's called sci-fi prototyping. Okay. And you know about this a little bit, Kuan, but the whole idea is that you are writing sci-fi stories. So I ended up writing 4 of them. And they are not about green aliens, invading the earth or whatever, but it's really about looking at technologies that are nascent right now, but could very well be mainstream, let's say in 2030, 2040. And what might be the impact of those from a human standpoint on human social life, economic, impact, or even emotional impact, right? And being able to do that sci-fi prototyping really allows you to imagine different futures and then pick the right desired future, hopefully, and then work towards that, right? So stretching that concept a little bit, I was thinking, we have a lot of conferences, but how might it be if we had some futuristic displays and immersive experiences and interactive displays, right? You talked about, I think, South by Southwest at some point when we were chatting. It's similar to that, but really taking it to the next level, where we are not going there for just exchanging information. There is not this cognitive overload, right, that typically happens in conferences, but it's really about that experiential aspect of it. So I would love to be, in a place where that is mainstream.
That sounds amazing. It would be like the fusion of Comic-Con, South by Southwest, and technology and innovation all in one place. That would be so cool.
Yeah, we need to make that happen.
I think so. Well, Prachi, I could not be more excited about getting to kick this podcast off with you. I feel like it's been, almost years in the making of us about this idea. And so thank you so much for being my partner in this. And hopefully everybody out there, enjoyed the conversation as much as we did.
Thanks so much to Kuan and Prachi for such a great conversation. This has been such an interesting look into the world of collaboration, and I can't wait to see what the next episode of Intersections has in store for our listeners. You can be the first to know when the next episode is slated for release by following all our socials, at UAH I2C on Instagram and Twitter, and UAH Invention to Innovation Center on Facebook. Onward and upward.